The United States, a nation founded on principles of liberty and justice for all, continues to grapple with a stark reality: the enduring legacy of racial injustice. From the era of slavery to the fight for civil rights, the struggle for racial equality has been a constant thread in the fabric of American history. In recent years, a series of high-profile cases involving black individuals, Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, Jussie Smollett, and George Floyd, have once again exposed the deep-seated racial divisions and systemic inequities that plague American society. These cases, each unique in its circumstances, have ignited national debates about race, policing, and justice, forcing Americans to confront uncomfortable truths about their nation. These cases are not isolated incidents. They are emblems of a larger pattern of racial bias and violence that disproportionately impacts black communities. The names of Trayvon, Michael, Freddie, and George have become synonymous with a justice system that often fails to protect and serve all its citizens equally. Their stories have sparked outrage, protests, and calls for reform, highlighting the urgent need to address the systemic racism that permeates American institutions. The circumstances surrounding these cases, while distinct, share a common thread. They expose the vulnerability of black lives in the face of racial profiling, police brutality, and a criminal justice system that too often operates with implicit bias. The deaths of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, and George Floyd in particular have reignited the debate over the use of lethal force by law enforcement, particularly against unarmed black men. These cases have also brought to the forefront the issue of racial profiling, highlighting the ways in which black individuals are disproportionately targeted by law enforcement. The Jussie Smollett case, while different in nature, underscores the complexities of race and justice in America. Smollett's false claim of a hate crime, though ultimately exposed, initially garnered widespread sympathy and support, reflecting the very real fear and trauma that hate crimes inflict on marginalized communities. However, the revelation that Smollett had fabricated the attack sparked outrage and accusations of exploiting racial tensions for personal gain, further complicating an already fraught national conversation about race. On a rainy February evening in 2012, 17-year-old Trayvon Martin, an unarmed black teenager, was walking back to his father's fiance's home in a gated community in Sanford, Florida, after a trip to a nearby convenience store. He was confronted by George Zimmerman, a neighborhood watch volunteer, who deemed Martin suspicious and initiated a confrontation. What transpired next would become a flashpoint in the national debate about race, gun violence, and the deeply ingrained biases that permeate American society. Zimmerman, armed with a handgun, called 911 to report Martin as a suspicious person. Despite being advised by the dispatcher not to follow Martin, Zimmerman pursued the teenager, igniting a confrontation that ended with Zimmerman fatally shooting Martin. Zimmerman claimed self-defense, arguing that Martin had attacked him. However, the lack of clear evidence and the circumstances surrounding the shooting, particularly Zimmerman's pursuit of Martin, fueled widespread outrage and accusations of racial profiling. The case quickly gained national attention, sparking protests and demands for Zimmerman's arrest. The Sanford Police Department initially declined to arrest Zimmerman, citing Florida's Stand Your Ground law, which allows the use of deadly force if a person reasonably believes they are in imminent danger of death or great bodily harm. However, after mounting public pressure and a state investigation, Zimmerman was eventually charged with second-degree murder. Zimmerman's acquittal in July 2013 sent shockwaves across the nation, igniting protests and reigniting the debate about racial profiling and the unequal application of justice in America. The verdict, while legally sound based on the evidence presented at trial, left many questioning whether Zimmerman would have been perceived as a threat or pursued in the same manner had Martin been white. The Trayvon Martin case served as a stark reminder of the implicit biases that shape perceptions of race and the deadly consequences of those perceptions. The August 2014 shooting of Michael Brown, an unarmed black teenager, by Darren Wilson, a white police officer in Ferguson, Missouri, ignited weeks of unrest and brought the issue of police brutality against black Americans back into the national spotlight. Brown's death and the subsequent grand jury decision not to indict Officer Wilson sparked widespread protests and a national conversation about race, policing, and the militarization of law enforcement. The circumstances surrounding Brown's death remain disputed, with conflicting accounts from witnesses. Some witnesses claimed that Brown had his hands raised in surrender, shouting, "Hands up, don't shoot," before being fatally shot by Officer Wilson. However, other witnesses, including Officer Wilson, maintained that Brown had been aggressive and had charged at the officer. The lack of a clear and undisputed narrative, coupled with the racial dynamics of the case, fueled tensions in Ferguson and across the nation. The grand jury's decision not to indict Officer Wilson sparked outrage and protests in Ferguson, which quickly escalated into riots and looting. The police response, characterized by the use of tear gas, rubber bullets, and armored vehicles, drew criticism for its militaristic approach and further inflamed tensions. The events in Ferguson exposed the deep-seated mistrust between law enforcement and communities of color, highlighting the need for greater police accountability, transparency, and community engagement. The Michael Brown case became a symbol of the systemic racism and implicit bias that many argue plague the criminal justice system. The hands-up, don't shoot gesture, whether factually accurate or not, became a rallying cry for protesters and a symbol of the perceived injustice faced by Black Americans at the hands of law enforcement. The case also highlighted the racial disparities in police shootings, with Black Americans disproportionately more likely to be killed by police than their white counterparts. The death of Freddie Gray, a 25-year-old black man in Baltimore, Maryland, in April 2015, while in police custody, sparked outrage and protests, exposing the deep-seated tensions between law enforcement and communities of color. Gray's death, which came after he suffered a severe spinal cord injury while being transported in a police van, ignited a national conversation about police brutality, racial profiling, and the lack of accountability for law enforcement officers. Gray's arrest, for allegedly possessing an illegal switchblade knife, was captured on bystander video, which showed officers dragging Gray to the police van. The circumstances surrounding Gray's fatal injury while in police custody remain unclear, but the incident raised serious questions about the use of force by the Baltimore Police Department and the lack of adequate medical attention provided to Gray. Gray's death sparked protests and unrest in Baltimore, with demonstrators demanding justice for Gray and an end to police brutality. The protests, which at times turned violent, highlighted the deep-seated frustration and anger within Baltimore's Black community over issues of poverty, inequality, and police misconduct. The city of Baltimore, already grappling with high rates of poverty and crime, found itself at the center of a national debate about race, policing, and the legacy of systemic racism. The 6 officers involved in Gray's arrest and transport were charged with various offenses, including second-degree depraved heart murder, manslaughter, and reckless endangerment. However, after a series of trials, none of the officers were convicted on any charges. The lack of conviction sparked outrage and disappointment, further fueling the perception that police officers operate with impunity, particularly when dealing with Black suspects. Section 5. Fabricated Justice, Jussie Smollett, and the Peril of False Narratives. The Jussie Smollett case, which unfolded in January 2019, stands as a stark reminder of the complexities of race, justice, and the media's role in shaping public perception. Smollett, a Black and gay actor, claimed to have been the victim of a racist and homophobic attack in Chicago, igniting a firestorm of media attention and public outrage. However, as the investigation progressed, inconsistencies in Smollett's account emerged, ultimately leading to charges against him for filing a false police report. Smollett's initial claims, which included allegations of being physically assaulted, doused with bleach, and having a noose placed around his neck, sparked widespread condemnation and calls for justice. The case, coming amid a backdrop of heightened racial and political tensions, resonated deeply with many who saw it as another example of hate-motivated violence against marginalized communities. However, as details of the investigation emerged, skepticism about Smollett's account began to grow. Chicago police, after an extensive investigation, concluded that Smollett had orchestrated the attack, paying 2 brothers he knew to stage the incident. The brothers, who claimed Smollett had paid them to carry out the attack, provided detailed accounts corroborating the police's theory. Smollett, who maintained his innocence, was charged with felony disorderly conduct for filing a false police report. The Smollett case, though ultimately revealed to be a hoax, had a significant impact on the national conversation about race and justice. It raised questions about the presumption of innocence, the power of media narratives, and the potential for false accusations to undermine genuine instances of hate crimes. The case also underscored the dangers of rushing to judgment and the importance of allowing due process to unfold before drawing conclusions. Section 6. The death that ignited a movement, George Floyd and the global reckoning. The death of George Floyd on May 25, 2020 under the knee of Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin ignited a firestorm of protests against police brutality and racial injustice that swept across the United States and reverberated around the world. Floyd's death, captured on a bystander's cell phone video, became a visceral symbol of the systemic racism and police brutality that Black Americans have faced for generations. The video, which showed Chauvin kneeling on Floyd's neck for over 9 minutes while Floyd pleaded for air and repeatedly said, "I can't breathe," sparked outrage and horror. The incident, which occurred during an arrest for allegedly using a counterfeit $20 bill, exposed the casual cruelty and disregard for Black life that many argue is endemic in law enforcement. Floyd's death became a rallying cry for justice and an end to police brutality. Protests, often led by Black Lives Matter activists, erupted in cities and towns across the United States and around the world. The demonstrations, which drew millions of participants, were largely peaceful, but sometimes turned violent, with looting and property damage. The protests reflected a deep-seated anger and frustration over the persistent racism and inequality that Black Americans face in all aspects of life, from policing to housing to healthcare. The trial of Derek Chauvin, which began in March 2021, became a focal point of the national reckoning on race and justice. The world watched as prosecutors presented evidence of Chauvin's actions, while the defense argued that Floyd's death was caused by underlying health conditions and drug use. In a historic verdict, Chauvin was found guilty of second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. Section 7. The stain of systemic racism, unveiling the roots of injustice. The cases of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, Jussie Smollett, and George Floyd, while distinct in their details, are united by a common thread. They expose the deeply ingrained systemic racism that permeates American society. This systemic racism, rooted in centuries of slavery, segregation, and discrimination, manifests in every aspect of American life, from policing and the criminal justice system to education, healthcare, and housing. Systemic racism refers to the ways in which racial bias is embedded in the policies, practices, and institutions that govern society. It is not simply about individual acts of prejudice, but about a system that advantages white people while disadvantaging people of color. This system operates both consciously and unconsciously, perpetuating racial disparities and inequities across generations. In the context of policing and the criminal justice system, systemic racism manifests in racial profiling, implicit bias, and the over-policing of Black and brown communities. Black Americans are disproportionately stopped, searched, arrested, and incarcerated compared to their white counterparts, even when controlling for crime rates. This racial disparity reflects the legacy of racist policies, such as the war on drugs, which has disproportionately targeted Black and brown communities. Systemic racism also permeates education, healthcare, and housing, leading to significant disparities in educational attainment, health outcomes, and wealth accumulation. Black and brown students are more likely to attend under-resourced schools, have less access to quality healthcare, and face discrimination in the housing market. These disparities reflect the historical and ongoing legacy of segregation and discrimination that continues to shape American society. Section 8. A Crossroads of Perspectives. Navigating the complexities of race and policing. The cases of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, Jussie Smollett, and George Floyd have sparked intense debate and a range of perspectives on race, policing, and justice in America. These perspectives, often shaped by personal experiences, political ideologies, and media narratives, reflect the complex and multifaceted nature of these issues. Navigating this complexity requires a nuanced understanding of the historical context, systemic factors, and individual perspectives that shape these debates. One perspective, often articulated by civil rights activists and community organizers, emphasizes the systemic racism and implicit bias that pervade law enforcement and the criminal justice system. This perspective highlights the disproportionate use of force against Black and brown individuals, the over-policing of minority communities, and the mass incarceration that has devastated Black and brown families. Another perspective, often voiced by law enforcement officials and their supporters, emphasizes the dangers and challenges of policing, the need for officer safety, and the importance of upholding law and order. This perspective argues that police officers often face difficult and dangerous situations, that the vast majority of officers are committed to serving and protecting their communities, and that the actions of a few bad apples should not tarnish the reputation of the entire profession. Still, other perspectives highlight the role of socioeconomic factors, such as poverty, lack of opportunity, and educational disparities, in contributing to crime and violence. This perspective argues that addressing these underlying social issues is crucial to reducing crime rates and improving police-community relations. Section 9. Legacy of Pain, Seeds of Change, the Enduring Impact on National Discourse. The cases of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, Jussie Smollett, and George Floyd have left an indelible mark on the American psyche, sparking a national reckoning on race, policing, and justice. These cases, though tragic, have served as catalysts for change, igniting a movement for social justice and forcing a long-overdue conversation about the systemic racism that permeates American society. The national conversation sparked by these cases has led to increased awareness of racial bias, police brutality, and the mass incarceration crisis. It has also led to calls for police reform, including increased accountability, transparency, and community oversight. The Black Lives Matter movement, which gained momentum after the death of Trayvon Martin, has become a powerful force for change, demanding an end to police brutality and racial injustice. The impact of these cases extends beyond the realm of policing and criminal justice. They have sparked conversations about race and racism in all aspects of American life, from education and healthcare to housing and employment. The conversation, though often uncomfortable and challenging, is essential to dismantling systemic racism and creating a more just and equitable society. The legacy of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, Jussie Smollett, and George Floyd is complex and multifaceted. Their deaths, though tragic, have served as a wake-up call, forcing Americans to confront the uncomfortable truths about their nation and to work towards a more just and equitable future for all. The fight for racial justice continues, and the memory of these individuals serves as a reminder of the work that remains to be done.